Hello. So today, inshallah, we're starting a series of topics about congenital heart disease. We'll start from the very beginning. We assume no previous knowledge of in cardiac congenital heart disease. However, we'll probably be building up to quite advanced topics. So today we start with pathophysiology of left right shunts. So this is a bit of a general concept rather than a specific disease. So we'll not be talking about one specific disease from beginning to end. However, we'll be talking about general concepts about what happens if the blood passes from the left side to the right side of the heart. I mean, things like ASD, VSD, PDA, AV canal, things like that, and how the physiology works in these patients. So starting from the very basic. So this is a normal heart, and this is the normal circulation. So we have two circulations in a normal individual. So we have the pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation. So blood comes from the systemic veins, deoxygenated, coming back from the body through SVC, IVC to right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary. So deoxygenated blood comes back from the body, going to the lungs, where it gets oxygenated and comes back, oxygenated blood through pulmonary veins, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, and then becomes deoxygenated. So the body takes its requirements of oxygen. Coming back the blood, deoxygenated, SVC, IVC, right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, and keeps going like that. Okay. So now we have two circulations. Do you think these circulations run in parallel or in series? In series. So deoxygenated blood to the heart, to the lung, pulmonary arteries, and then pulmonary veins to the heart, and then systemic arteries to the body, and then systemic veins to the heart, and keeps going like that. Okay. So these are two circulations that keep going, following each other. So like a long queue, and then they run in series. So to demonstrate that fact, let's assume that we interrupt the circulation at one point. Let's assume a patient gets a massive pulmonary embolism. When you cut this end, so the main pulmonary artery is just occluded. Okay? So these patients die. Okay? Why do you think they die? Do you think they die of hypoxia? Or do they die of low cardiac output?
No, hypoxia too.
Hypoxia.
Hypoxia and low cardiac output. Both.
So why do we get cyanosis? You get cyanosis if you get deoxygenated blood into the aorta. Okay? In these patients, you do not get any blood to the aorta. Okay? So the blood queue will just stop here. So the blood that makes it to the aorta will be oxygenated. But then actually there will be no pulmonary venous return because the circulation was interrupted here. So the systemic circulation also will stop. So can you get this?
Yes.
Okay? So I'm just stressing on the fact that to go to the systemic circulation, you have to come back from the pulmonary circulation. And to go to the pulmonary circulation, you have to come back from the systemic circulation, and you keep going like that. Okay? So let's state some very basic principles. So the quite obvious is that blood flows from high pressure to low pressure. This is easy. Huh? Okay. So, and the chambers that get volume load, this chamber will get dilatation. While on the other hand, if a chamber gets pressure load, this chamber will become hypertrophied. Okay? And we've stated already that systemic and pulmonary circulations flow in series. Okay. So we do have an important fact here, is that how do we calculate the amount of blood flow? What is blood flow?
The volume of blood.
Volume of blood
And the speed.
per unit time.
Yes, and the
Okay?
speed.
So if someone is staying at the entrance of the pulmonary circulation and keeps counting the amount, the volume of blood per unit time, this is defined as blood flow into the pulmonary circulation, the same as the systemic. Okay. So to be able to calculate this this blood flow, you get delta P divided by the resistance to this vessel. Okay. So Q is the flow. So the pulmonary or the systemic blood flow or flow through any vessel, okay, is the delta P, the pressure difference before and after the vessel, divided by the resistance across that vessel. Okay. So we have two circulations, the systemic or the pulmonary. Which one of them has more flow? So is the pulmonary flow higher or the systemic flow higher in a normal person?
Systemic flow is high.
Systemic flow is higher.
Equally. Because in series, the same blood will go to the lung, will go back to the
Maybe the pressure is different.
Yeah,
The pressure is different.
Yeah, but
Pressure is
The flow is not.
No.
No.
So this is the concept of the ratio between the pulmonary flow and the systemic flow. In a normal person, the ratio between the pulmonary flow and the systemic flow is 1, because normally the pulmonary blood flow, the amount of pulmonary blood flow, so the volume per unit time that goes into the pulmonary circulation, is nearly equal to the systemic blood flow, which is the volume of blood going to the systemic circulation in the same amount of time. Okay? Why is that? You said the pressure is very different,
Yes.
but the flow is the same. This is because of the fact that the circulation runs in series. So the blood that will go into the pulmonary circulation has to come from the systemic,
Yes.
and the amount that goes to the systemic has to come to. So let's simplify this. Let's assume that this is a big room. This is a narrow corridor, and we have two doors here. This is a wall, and we have two doors here. One door here, one door there. Okay, and then a few people will go in these directions. Okay, they go in one direction, and then they have to go through this door, cross the room, then this door, cross the corridor, and keep going like that. Okay, this is very wide. This is quite narrow. So if someone is staying at that door, counting the amount of people going in 1 minute, and another person staying here, counting the amount of people crossing that door in the same minute, do you think which one will count more?
The same people.
The same
The same people that are going.
The same people that are going here and there. People will find it very easy to cross here.
Yes.
They get crowded here,
But they still.
but if you count them, they will be the same. This becomes very different if someone can cross the wall and go here. Then this person will count a lot more people than this one. But if you do not do that, if both circulations go in series, they have to be the same number per unit time. Okay? So this is pulmonary circulation with low resistance. This is systemic circulation with high resistance. Do you get this?
Yes.
So because of the fact that the circulations go in series, then the pulmonary blood flow has to be the same as the systemic blood flow, so long as there are no shunts. Okay? If we have shunts, then one circulation can get a lot more flow than the other. Do you get that concept?
Yes.
This is important. Okay? So we agreed that the systemic flow equals to the pulmonary flow.
Yes.
And since the the flow is equal to the pressure gradient across the vessel divided by the resistance. So how would that apply for the pulmonary circulation? So what's the pressure gradient across the pulmonary?
No pressure.
What is the gradient? The gradient is the pressure difference. So what is the pressure difference across the pulmonary circulation? So it's the difference between the pulmonary artery pressure and the left atrial pressure. So the pulmonary artery and pulmonary venous pressure. So it's the difference between the pressure in the pulmonary arteries and the pressure in the left atrium. So this is the transpulmonary pressure. Okay? So, and what's the difference between what's the pressure gradient across the systemic circulation?
So the difference between the main pulmonary artery pressure.
So I'm sorry. This was the pulmonary pressure gradient. What's the systemic pressure gradient?
So descending aorta.
From the ascending aorta, from the aorta
Yes.
to the eventually right atrium.
Yes.
And this is the pressure difference across that. Okay. And what constitutes the pulmonary vascular resistance? So the vascular resistance is affected by the vascular bed, essentially by the arterioles in the pulmonary vascular bed, the same in the systemic. Okay. So since in a normal person they are the same, so the pressure gradient in the systemic divided by the resistance, systemic vascular resistance, is equal to the pulmonary pressure gradient divided by the pulmonary vascular resistance. Do you get that? Okay. In a normal person, which is higher, the pulmonary pressure or the systemic pressure?
Systemic pressure.
Systemic pressure. And why is that?
The resistance is higher in the systemic circulation.
Or do you think because of the LV generates higher pressure?
Okay, LV generates pressure, but there is more resistance to overcome.
Okay. So is it because of the ventricle that has higher pressure, or because of the resistance that is higher?
The resistance. That's what.
The resistance is higher. Because remember in the TGA, transpositional grade arteries, the LV is assigned to the pulmonary circulation, and still the peer pressure is way less than the systemic pressure. So the pressure is a byproduct. Is a byproduct of the amount of flow that has to cross against the resistance. So in normal, the systemic vascular resistance is much higher than the pulmonary vascular resistance. And so the left ventricle, to be able to pass the amount of cardiac output, that amount of blood flow, will have to push very hard to be able to push that amount of volume against the high systemic vascular resistance. And that's why the left ventricle will have to generate higher pressure. And so the systemic pressure is high. While on the other hand, the right ventricle has the same amount of volume. And then when it pushes it, it finds a really low resistance. So the blood will just pass without having to push a lot. And so the pulmonary pressure is much lower. Do you get that? So since the pulmonary flow is equal to the systemic flow, and the pulmonary vascular resistance is a lot lower than the systemic vascular resistance, so the pulmonary artery pressure will be much lower than the systemic pressure. Okay? So the inherent fact in the circulation is the resistance, while the pressure is a byproduct. Do you agree?
Yes.
So since the systemic vascular resistance is higher than the pulmonary vascular resistance, so the systemic pressure has to be much higher than the pulmonary pressure. Okay? So actually, the pulmonary vascular resistance is much lower than the systemic vascular resistance. This is the fact in adulthood. Okay? So during the fetal life, the pulmonary vascular resistance is much higher, so much higher. Why do you think is that?
Because the lungs are filled with fluid.
Okay.
They are collapsing.
They are collapsed.
Yes.
So in the fetal life, there is no air in the lungs. So the lungs are collapsed, compressing the vessels. So the pressure is high, the resistance of these vessels are high. Also for the fact that the oxygen is a very potent pulmonary vasodilator. And actually the oxygen content in the lungs is very low in the fetal blood as compared to the adulthood. Okay? So during the fetal life, the pulmonary vascular resistance is quite high. So the pressure there is high. And then once the baby gets delivered at birth, the pulmonary vascular resistance sharply decreases. Okay? That's because both reasons have reverted. So now the lungs gets inflated, so the compression against the vessels is much lower, and actually the high FI2 in the alveoli causes significant pulmonary vasodilatation, and so the pulmonary vascular resistance drops a lot. Okay. So this occurs sharply at birth, but to reach its adult level, it takes a few weeks, something like 6 to 8 weeks, where it keeps going down till you reach the stable pulmonary vascular resistance. Okay. So now I've said we have two circulations, systemic and pulmonary. Normally they pass in series. The flow is equal to the pressure gradient divided by the resistance across any circulation. Normally the pulmonary flow is equal to the systemic flow. That's because both circulations pass in series. And since the systemic vascular resistance is much higher than the pulmonary vascular resistance, so normally the systemic pressure is much higher than the pulmonary pressure. Okay. So now we've agreed that blood flows from high pressure to low pressure. Okay, and normally there are no significant communications between the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation. Okay, what if we have communication? How would blood flow? From high pressure to lower pressure. Okay, so if we have a communication between the aorta and pulmonary, so something like a PDA, patent ductus arteriosus, would the blood flow from the aorta to the pulmonary or the reverse? Aorta to pulmonary. Why is that? Pressure in the aorta is higher than pressure in the pulmonary. And why is that? Because the systemic vascular resistance is higher than the pulmonary vascular resistance. So the ventricle exerts higher pressure to push the blood against the systemic vascular resistance, while the pulmonary vascular resistance is much lower. So the pressure in the pulmonary circulation is lower. And so if there is a communication, blood will flow from the higher pressure to the lower pressure. That's to say from the aorta to the pulmonary. Do you agree on that? So does the blood flow from the aorta to pulmonary? Does that occur in systole or diastole or both?
For the PDA, both.
No, it occurs in systole.
What's the systolic pressure in the aorta in a normal adult?
Maybe 100.
120, something like that. So if we assume that the systemic pressure is 120 or 80, while the pulmonary pressure is 20, 25 over 15. Okay, so the systolic pressure in the aorta is 120, while the systolic pressure in the pulmonary is 25. So there will be systolic flow from aorta to pulmonary. Do you agree?
Yes.
How about diastole? Still, the diastolic pressure in the aorta is 80, while the diastolic pressure in the pulmonary is like 10, 15. So still there is a high gradient. So blood flows in PDA from aorta to pulmonary, systolic and diastolic. So in PDA, the flow in the PDA is continuous. Continuous flow, systolic and diastolic. Okay? Okay, let's assume another patient has a VSD, ventricular circle defect. So a communication between the left ventricle and right ventricle. How would blood flow? Left ventricle to right ventricle or to the opposite? Right ventricle to left ventricle.
Left.
Left ventricle to right ventricle. Why is that?
Because
LV
the
pressure is higher.
Because the pressure in the LV is higher than the. Why is that?
Because then we have to push higher
Against resistance.
And because the pressure in the aorta is higher, and why is that? Because the systemic vascular resistance is higher. So the left ventricle generates higher pressure.
Yes.
So the pressure in the left ventricle is high,
Yes.
while the RV is facing the pulmonary circulation, which is low resistance, so low pressure. So the pressure goes from left ventricle to right ventricle. Is that systolic, diastolic, or both?
Systolic.
What is systolic LV pressure?
About 100 too.
But the same, if there is no aortic stenosis, there will be the same pressure as the aorta, like 120. Okay. What's the systolic RV pressure? Same like the pulmonary, something like 20-25. So there will be systolic flow from left ventricle to right ventricle.
Yes.
Agree.
Yes.
What about diastolic?
Still, because the diastolic LV pressure, diastolic LV pressure is higher than
So diastolic LV pressure is slightly higher than the diastolic RV pressure. The difference is like 2-3 millimeter mercury. And so there will be some flow, but actually minimal in comparison to the amount of flow that passes in systole. Okay? So we consider flow in VSD as systolic flow. Okay? This is very different than flow from aorta to pulmonary because the difference is very, very high. Okay? Okay. What about ASD? If a patient has a communication between the left atrium and right atrium, would the flow be systolic? Okay, let's say, would the flow be from LA to RA or the opposite? So from left atrium to right atrium, or the opposite from right atrium to left atrium? And why?
Left atrium to right atrium.
Left atrium to right atrium, so still left to right shunt.
Yes.
Why is that?
Left atrial pressure is higher.
Left pressure is higher. Why?
And there's much more blood coming from the pulmonary vein.
Why?
Because with the shunt between the ASD will increase the blood flow going to the pulmonary.
But then it has to go at first from left to right,
Yes.
so that the pulmonary flow increases. Why does it go from left to right in the first place?
I think there's still the pressure that the right atrial pressure is still lower because it still comes from the femoral vein, IVC to the right atrium.
And so?
So that pressure will.
Okay, let's assume we have a normal patient that has no communication. Okay, and then the pulmonary flow is equal to the systemic flow.
Yes.
Do you agree on that?
Yes.
So pulmonary venous return is equal to the systemic venous return. I agree on that. Now, if we make communication between the left atrium and right atrium, how will blood flow?
From left to right.
Why? From left to right. Why?
Increased venous return.
Okay. We've agreed that blood will flow from high pressure to low pressure.
Yes.
And so, yes, I do agree that left atrial pressure is slightly higher than the right atrial pressure. But why is that?
The left atrium, I think, is a bigger. Maybe because of the pressure, some back pressure generated from the left.
venous return venous return and the right atrium has to be above at same pressure to allow venous return, like zero. I don't remember the term.
Pressure is byproduct.
Um,
What causes the pressure to be lower? Okay. The systemic vascular resistance is higher than the pulmonary vascular resistance. Do you agree? So the pressure in the aorta is higher than the pressure in the pulmonary. But this cannot be translated directly into the atrium because in systole, the left ventricle pumps the blood into the aorta at high pressure, while the RV is much lower. But then the mitral and tricuspid are closed, so the atria are isolated from that. Okay? While when the atria communicate with the ventricles, the aorta and pulmonary valves will be closed. So again, the systemic and the pulmonary pressures are not transferred directly to atrium. Okay? But actually, this does affect flow, but indirectly. How is that? So the systemic vascular resistance is high. So the systemic pressure is high. So the left ventricle has to exert higher pressure to push the blood into the systemic circulation. As a response in that, if you go to the gym, you do a lot of exercises, you get bigger muscles.
Yes.
And so the wall thickness of the left ventricle will become more than the wall thickness of the right ventricle that doesn't exert the same pressure. Okay? So the left ventricular wall thickness is much thicker than the right ventricular wall thickness. Assume you are trying to blow into a balloon. Is it easier to blow into a thicker balloon or into a very thin balloon? Thin balloon is much easier. So exerting the same pressure, the thinner balloon will adapt a lot more volume. This is called compliance. So what is compliance? Compliance is amount of volume per unit pressure. So assuming you exert 1 millimeter mercury of pressure, how much volume would you adapt? Okay? The right ventricle compliance is much more than the left ventricular compliance, because the right ventricular wall thickness is much less than the left ventricular wall thickness. And so if the left ventricular wall thickness is thicker and you have to push the same amount of volume, you have to push by higher pressure. And so the left ventricular end diastolic pressure is slightly higher than the right ventricular end diastolic pressure. And since in diastole atria communicate with ventricles, so the left atrial pressure will be slightly higher than the right atrial pressure. And that's why you get left to right shunt from left atrium to right atrium. Have you got that?
Yes.
Okay. So why is blood flow from aorta to pulmonary? Because systemic vascular resistance is higher, so systemic pressure is higher.
Yes.
Why is flow from left atrium, left ventricle to right ventricle? Because this ventricle has to push against this resistance, so has to generate higher pressure. So LV pressure is higher than the RV pressure. Why is blood flowing from left atrium to right atrium? Because LV end diastolic pressure is slightly higher, because the left ventricular compliance is worse than the right ventricular compliance. So left atrial pressure is slightly higher than the right atrial pressure. So net flow across the atria is from left to right. Okay? So compliance is delta V over delta P. So difference in volume per unit pressure. Okay? So let's talk about what would that do to the ventricular, to the chamber sizes. So how would flow from left atrium to right atrium affect chambers in terms of enlargement? We have agreed that volume load causes dilatation, while pressure load causes hypertrophy. Okay. So this is a block diagram from Parks. Park is a really good book. I really recommend reading the part of Pathophysiology in Parks. So here we assume that these are systemic veins, SVC, IVC, right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery. Then blood comes back through pulmonary veins, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta. Okay. Now we assume that there is an ASD, significant atrial septal defect, and then the blood will flow from left atrium to right atrium. We just agree on that.
Yes.
How would that affect the chambers in terms of enlargement? I mean, dilatation or hypertrophy or none. Okay. I will go chamber by chamber, and then you tell me what chamber will get what change. Okay. So how about the SVC IVC? Would that be dilated? No. Right atrium, it gets volume load. It gets more volume. So the right atrium will get dilated if you get left to right shunt across an ASD. What about right ventricle? Dilated. More volume load than dilated. Pulmonary arteries? Yes, dilated because the more volume will go through the pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary veins?
Yes.
The blood that goes to the lung has to come back. So the more amount volume going through the pulmonary arteries will have to come back through the pulmonary veins. So again, the amount of volume passing through the pulmonary veins will be increased. So the pulmonary veins will be dilated. Left atrium.
It's pressure. So it will push back again.
So let's skip this for now. Okay. Left ventricle.
No.
Actually less, because the amount of blood that was supposed to go to the left ventricle passes through the ASD. So less blood will go to the left ventricle. So the left ventricle will not be dilated.
Yeah.
Aorta,
No.
not. Again, because the less amount of blood. So I've agreed on right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins.
Yes.
Will more volume go to the left atrium in case of an ASD? Yes. Because the blood going to the lungs will come back through pulmonary veins, and all the blood coming back through pulmonary veins will have to go to the left atrium. So the amount of blood volume going to the left atrium will actually increase.
Yes.
But then for a chamber to dilate, blood has to stay for a while so that it stretches its wall. Okay?
Yes.
And this does not happen with the left atrium, because blood coming back to the left atrium will just shunt into the right atrium. So the blood does not stay long enough in the left atrium to cause it to dilate. So in patients with ASD, they get dilated right side of the heart, in addition to the pulmonary vessels, arteries and veins, but not the left side. Okay? So although there are more blood that passes through the left atrium, but it doesn't stay long enough to cause it to dilate. Okay? So you get dilated pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins. Let's just agree that any patient that has left to right shunt will have higher pulmonary blood flow. Patients with higher pulmonary blood flow will get dilated pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins,
Yes.
regardless of the cause of the left to right shunts. Okay? So patients with ASD, in addition to the dilated pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins, they get dilated right side of the heart. Okay? So you tell me, how would you detect dilated right atrium and right ventricle in ECG and chest X-ray? So ECG,
ECG.
dilated right atrium,
Tall P wave.
tall P wave in lead 2, okay, and in V1. And how do you detect dilated right ventricle in ECG?
High pluralist complex.
So tall R in V1, so R is higher than the S in V1. Okay, that's the very basic thing. How do you detect the dilated right atrium and right ventricle in chest X-ray?
Lateral X-ray.
So how do you detect dilated right atrium and right ventricle, pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins in chest X-ray?
So it depends on the film that you take. If you take a post-anterior view,
Okay, post-anterior view.
you will see a dilated PA. On
So the right border of the heart
yes,
is enlarged, okay, and there's cardiomegaly
yes,
because the ventricle is big.
yes.
And how do you know that this is right ventricle, not the left?
You do a lateral
X-ray, and you see obliteration of the retrosternal space. Okay. How do you detect dilated pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins on chest X-ray? So pulmonary artery shadow is bigger, and pulmonary veins by the plethora. Okay. So you get the displaced right border of the heart, the cardiomegaly, large the pulmonary artery shadow, and the plethora. Okay. Just to get this, plethora is a higher pulmonary flow. Congestion is obstructed venous return. Okay, but the term pulmonary congestion is widely used to mean plethora. This is not exactly correct, but maybe you'll hear a lot about people saying the chest X-ray is congested, and people mean plethoric. Okay, so we're not in the state of correcting this. Just just know the fact that if you hear people saying congested, they might be meaning plethoric. Okay, plethora is more blood flow. And on chest X-ray, lateral film, you can see the obliteration of the retrosternal space because of the dilated right ventricle. Okay, what if the patient has a VSD? So blood flows from left ventricle to right ventricle through a defect. So again, SVC, IVC, not dilated. Right atrium, not dilated. Right ventricle, it has higher blood volume. Blood went through the VS.
The blood will not stay longer.
So again, let's skip this to the end. Okay, that's controversial. Let's skip this. Pulmonary arteries, dilated. Pulmonary veins, dilated. Left atrium, dilated. Left ventricle, skip it for now. Okay. Aorta, not dilated. Okay. So now we have agreed that SVC, IVC, right atrium, and aorta will not be dilated, and we have agreed that pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins, and left atrium will be dilated because of higher blood volume. So, which ventricle will get dilated, or both? So again, so there is a higher blood volume in the left atrium coming back from the lung. Okay? And then in diastole, will more blood go to the left ventricle or less? In diastole? In diastole more, because in diastole you get the blood volume in the left atrium, which is higher than normal. So diastolic flow into the left ventricle is higher. So, and this blood actually stays in the left ventricle long enough during diastole, because the flow across the VSD is mainly systolic. So during diastole, you get long enough period for the higher volume to stretch the wall of the left ventricle to get dilated. What about systole? During systole, a lot of blood will pass from the left ventricle to right ventricle. But then the right ventricle will be contracted. And then the blood will not stay long enough in the right ventricle because it will just use it as a pathway into the lungs. So the blood will just pass through the right ventricle into the lungs. It does not stay there long enough in diastole to cause it to dilate. So although a lot more volume passes through the right ventricle, it doesn't stay there long enough to cause it to dilate. Okay? While the left ventricle gets dilated, because during diastole, the diastolic blood flow into the ventricle is more. Okay? So again, in the VSD, you get dilated pulmonary artery, pulmonary veins, and you get dilated left side of the heart. So in ASD, you get dilated right side, while VSD, you get dilated left side. You now know why. So this is a quick overview. If you have a really small VSD with very small amount of blood shunting across it, you get not much change because it's too small to get detected. Okay? So maybe normal X-ray or tiny enlargement and not much change in ECG. Well, if you get moderate VSD where you get higher blood volume, then you get moderate change on X-ray and ECG. If you get really large VSD, so the blood will be a lot of blood volume passing through the VSD, and actually pressure transfer into the right ventricle and the lungs, which will cause hypertrophy in the right ventricle. So the right ventricle will get a lot higher pressure than it is supposed to get, and pressure load causes hypertrophy. So you can detect hypertrophy. And then we'll discuss this in a minute. So detecting enlarged left atrium, left ventricle, pulmonary arteries, and pulmonary veins in ECG and X-ray. So in ECG you get wider P waves. Okay, you check that in lead 2. And left ventricle, lots of criteria for left LV لغاية R deep S and lots of criteria for the LV. And how do you detect that on X-ray? So the cardiomegaly, enlarged the atrial shadow. You get enlarged pulmonary artery shadow. You get plethora. And the double contour for the left atrium. Let's discuss the concept of a big VSD or a small VSD. This is a really important concept. What do we mean by calling the VSD as a non-restrictive VSD? What is an unrestricted VSD? Okay. What is a restricted VSD?
Because there's restriction in the blood flow going from one side to another side, so there's restriction.
Okay, so a defect is restricted if it restricts blood flow across it. So blood wants to go from the left ventricle to the right ventricle. So if you get a communication in between, if the communication restricts blood flow from one chamber to the other, this means that the VSD is small, so it does not allow enough blood to go across. Okay? It does not allow equalization of pressure across it. Okay? While if you have a big VSD, this does not restrict blood flow, so it will allow the blood that wants to just cross to the other side till the pressure gets equalized, and then blood will not move from one side to the other because now the pressure is equal. Okay? Let's give an example of that. Let's assume that we have a problem in the air conditioner, and now it keeps pushing air in this room and doesn't get air out. And now the pressure gets really, really high in this room. Okay? What if we have a really small hole in this wall? So if someone is staying outside, he'll notice a lot of a jet of air coming outside from inside the room to the outside. Okay? So there is flow of air across that defect. But then would the pressure in this room becomes equal to the pressure outside? No, because the hole is really small, so it restricts flow so that it does not allow equalization of pressures. So this is a restricted defect. Okay? What if we take out the whole wall?
There will be no restriction, everything.
There will be no restriction to flow, and then the pressure will just equalize to the outside. This is an unrestricted defect. That's exactly the same. So unrestricted VSD is a VSD that is large enough to so that it does not restrict blood flow, so that it allows equalization of pressures across it. Okay? Which means it is large VSD. So now let's assume that the LV pressure in a patient who has a VSD, so a patient has a VSD, the LV pressure is 100, while the RV pressure is 80. Would you consider that a restricted or unrestricted VSD? There is a pressure drop? 20. Okay, let's assume the pressure drop is 30.
Pressure in the RV?
Yes. So the pressure in the RV is 70, the pressure in LV is 100. Would you consider that as a restrictive or unrestricted VSD?
Moderate.
What about the pressure drop is 40?
Respectively.
Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
If there is a pressure drop of 20, that means when the systemic pressure is 100, the pulmonary pressure is 80, which is really high. So all the changes that are caused by the high volume and the high pressure in the lung will still occur with this pressure drop. Pulmonary artery pressure of 80 is quite high. Okay? We say a restrictive VSD, we mean a clinically significant restriction across the VSD. Which means that the pulmonary pressure, the pulmonary circulation, is protected from the high pressure and the high flow coming from the left side. And so we're talking about PA pressure, which is less than half systemic, nearly third systemic. Okay? So we have to get a significant pressure drop across the VSD to call it a restrictive. So if the pressure in the aorta is 100, the pressure in the pulmonary is like 40. Okay? So restricted VSD is a small VSD that restricts blood flow in a clinically significant way, so that the pulmonary artery pressure is significantly less than the systemic pressure. While an unrestricted VSD is a VSD that is big enough that does not restrict blood flow, so that it allows the pressure to be transferred into the lung, causing an unprotected pulmonary circulation. Okay?
So what is the figure? A third systemic is restricted?
So it depends. It depends obviously on the ratio between the systemic and the pulmonary. So if the pressure in the aorta is 120 and the pressure gradient is 40, this still means that the pulmonary pressure is 80, which is quite high. But if the systemic pressure is 60 and the pressure drop is 40, the pulmonary pressure will be 20, which is like third systemic. So it's more of the ratio between them rather than an absolute figure of gradient. So we're talking about less than half systemic approaching third systemic. This means that the pulmonary circulation is protected. Okay. So a patient gets a large unrestricted VSD. So there's a lot of blood and a lot of high pressure going into the pulmonary circulation. And now blood flow to the pulmonary circulation is really, really high. And so the pressure inside the pulmonary vessels are high. So the filtration across the pulmonary capillaries is high. And so the fluid in the interstitium of the lung is more than normal. And so the space in between the alveoli and the capillaries gets filled by fluid. And so the gas exchange gets less. So these patients get difficulty in breathing because they are more difficult to get gas exchange. And so they get dyspnea. If a small baby gets such a dyspnea, he will keep interrupted feeding because he has to take some breath because of the dyspnea. And so such a baby gets does more effort and gets less nutrition because he keeps interrupted feeding because of the dyspnea. So they get failure to thrive. They do not grow well. A lot of fluid into the interstitial tissue of the lungs is a good culture medium. So you get more chest infections. So these patients will get more dyspnea, symptoms of heart failure, failure to thrive, and repeated chest infections. Okay. So now we have an unrestricted VSD, really high pressure into the lungs. So the pulmonary arterioles keeps getting high pressure, high pressure, high pressure, and then they start to decide to defend themselves, and so they vasoconstrict. Okay? So when the pulmonary arterioles vasoconstrict, how would that affect pulmonary vascular resistance? Will increase. So pulmonary vascular resistance increases. What happens to the pressure proximal to that? Increase.
Yes.
And so what about the pressure difference between the systemic and the pulmonary? will be less. So the pressure difference will be less. So the shunting from the left ventricle to the right ventricle will be less. So more blood will go to the systemic than it used to do before, which is a good thing. So the patient starts to get less symptoms.
Yes,
You agree on that? Such a patient was very symptomatic. By the way, was he very symptomatic since birth?
No, they get symptomatic 8 weeks.
Because at birth, pulmonary vascular resistance is slightly higher, and so they get significant symptoms after like 4, 6, 8 weeks from birth. Okay? So at first they were okayish, and then started developing significant symptoms because of the high pulmonary flow, because of the lowering pulmonary vascular resistance. And then they start to get vasoconstriction in the pulmonary arterioles, and so the symptoms gradually start to improve. So the pulmonary arterioles will get vasoconstricted, defend themselves. Then we close the VSD, and so the pulmonary arterioles will just dilate again. So that's a reversible pulmonary vasoconstriction. Okay? Okay. So let's assume that we have not closed the VSD. We kept the VSD with that unrestriction. So the pressure in the lungs are really high. Pulmonary arterioles vasoconstricted, fibrosed. So now the resistance is truly high. And then the resistance keeps going higher till actually the pressure in the lungs becomes higher than the pressure in the systemic. And then the pressure in the OV gets higher than the pressure in the LV. And so blood will start going from the right ventricle to the left ventricle, because now it is more difficult for the right ventricle to push the blood against the lungs than to push it through the VSD to the systemic. Okay? So you get blood from the RV going to the aorta. What will that cause? Cyanosis. The blood in the right ventricle is coming from the systemic veins, deoxygenated. So now you get a significant amount of deoxygenated blood going into the aorta. Okay? So a patient that has a left-right shunt that causes increased pulmonary flow, that cause irreversible increase in the pulmonary vascular resistance, causing reversal of the shunt. This condition is called Eisenmenger syndrome. So what is Eisenmenger syndrome? Eisenmenger syndrome is a patient who had left-right shunt that was large enough to cause increase in the pulmonary vascular resistance, and that increase has become irreversible and high enough so that it caused the shunt to reverse, so that it becomes from right to left, causing significant cyanosis. This is Eisenmenger syndrome. Okay, what if we get a patient with Eisenmenger syndrome and now we close the VSD? What will happen with the pulmonary arterioles? Will they dilate? No. Because now this is irreversible damage. Frequently they get actually even progressive. Okay? What will happen then to the right ventricle? Acute failure. Because it used to vent its blood, it was not able to push enough blood, the whole systemic venous return into the lungs, so had to vent some into the left ventricle to the aorta. And now this has stopped. And now it has to pass all the blood against the very high pulmonary vascular resistance. It just fails. So if we do that, patients do not come out of theater. They die on table. Okay? This is really serious. So if a patient gets an Eisenmenger syndrome, they should not have their shunts closed. Okay? Okay, so when would that happen in a patient with an unrestricted VSD? I mean, age. At what age?
It depends on the size of large shunt.
So obviously this is a quite range, so patients range very widely, and there's no, there's no button that you say now it's reversible, now it's totally irreversible. It's a grayish area, but roughly in the range of like 2 to 3 years, patient with unrestricted VSD can get Eisenmenger syndrome as early as 2 to 3 years of age. What about if a patient has a big ASD? How long would it take him to get Eisenmenger? 40, 60 years, quite long. Okay, why is that? Okay, let's assume a patient has the amount of pulmonary blood flow, has a VSD, and the pulmonary blood flow is higher than the systemic blood flow 3 times. So I mean, QP, QS is 3 to 1. So patient with VSD, QPQS 3. Patient with ASD, QPQS 3. Would they be Eisenmenger at the same time? No. This will occur in VSD much earlier, so much earlier. Why is that? Although it's the same amount of blood flow. Because the pulmonary vascular bed gets injured with the high pressure. The high systemic pressure gets directly transmitted into the pulmonary vascular bed. While in the ASD, although the QPQS is 3, pulmonary artery pressure might still be normal. Because the pulmonary vascular resistance is really low, so that it can accept like 3 times the volume without significantly increasing the pressure. Okay? So it takes an ASD to get like 40, 50, 60 years to get Eisenmenger, while in the VSD, you get that 2, 3, 4 years. Okay? Okay, now I have a patient who is 5 years of age, unrestricted VSD, Eisenmenger. And now I tell him, okay, we cannot do an operation, you do not have a surgical option, you just go. When would such patient die? Like what age?
Maybe 10 years.
Like 50% of patients with Eisenmenger syndrome survive till 20 years. 20 years. His Eisenmenger like 2-3 years of age. They survive till 20 years. Obviously with less quality of life, they get cyanosed, they get less exercise capacity. So has a whole lecture about Eisenmenger syndrome. Now we're talking about pathophysiology. So patients with Eisenmenger syndrome can survive as long as maybe even like half of them. The median survival with the Eisenmenger syndrome is nearly 20 years of age. What if we close the VSD? They die on table. So we should not close the defect in a patient with Eisenmenger syndrome. How do you diagnose an Eisenmenger syndrome?
You do CAT. You can do several tests.
So it's not CAT. Yes, CAT, but
Yeah,
CAT
several tests.
is the last step.
So
Okay.
that's the oxygen saturation.
The age of the patient and the type of the disease. So if he's a VSD and he's 3 months of age, very unlikely to be Eisenmenger. If he's a VSD, 7 years of age, quite likely to be an Eisenmenger. ASD, 3 years of age, very unlikely. You see what I mean?
Yes.
So, age of patient, type of disease. Symptoms.
Yes.
So these patients have symptoms of high pulmonary flow, gradually improving symptoms, then gradually starting to get cyanosis. Okay? What else?
Chest X-ray from pleural.
Oxygen saturation.
Okay.
A patient telling me that I get cyanosed or I get blue, or you see him as cyanosed is one thing, and you actually measuring oxygen saturation and finding that the saturation is 80 is another thing.
Yes.
Okay? So do not forget to use the pulse oximeter. Not necessarily a blood test, just the pulse oximeter. Okay? So age, history, oxygen saturation,
Yes.
chest X-ray.
Yes.
What do you get in a chest X-ray?
I think all
No microcardiomegaly because the left to right shunts have stopped.
Yes.
So the cardiomegaly, the volume load has stopped.
Yes.
So the heart shadow will become smaller. What about the lung fields? Will they be plethoric?
No.
No, because now the pulmonary blood flow is actually less. So, and this is evident in the peripheral lung fields, while in the central you get big pulmonary artery shadow. Okay. What else?
ECG
ECG.
changes.
You get.
You get features of depending on the lesion again.
Okay. So let's assume I have a VSD, large VSD.
So you get now a
Right ventricular hypertrophy,
hypertrophy
and no more left ventricular dilatation. Okay.
and you get a
Echo.
echo the shunt you have reverse.
A-
Right to left.
A big VSD to start with.
Yes.
So you find the big VSD, the cause for that,
Yes.
and then
No
the
more.
direction of flow across the shunt.
Yes.
Is it right to left or left to right?
Right to left.
You try to estimate pulmonary artery pressure from echo. Probably Soha will talk about that quite enough. Okay, so now you get a patient who has a big VSD. The shunt is bidirectional or right to left, and the PA pressure estimated to be very high.
Yes.
What will you do next?
Then the size of the ventricles.
The size of the ventricle, and the left ventricle is no more dilated, and the right ventricle is hypertrophy. What else?
Then there could be regurgitation of the tricuspid valve because initially.
To estimate our RV pressure. Okay. What else apart from echo? So now symptoms, pulse oximeter, chest X-ray, ECG, echo suggestive of Eisenmenger syndrome. So you do cardiac cath. What do you measure in cath? So you measure pulmonary artery pressure to start with, because you cannot get an Eisenmenger syndrome with a PA pressure of 25, and then it will be a different disease. Okay. So you measure PA pressure. You calculate pulmonary vascular resistance. We'll talk about that. Pulmonary vascular resistance is a calculation rather than a direct measurement. You directly measure pressure, but actually you calculate resistance. Okay. And then you have found that the pressure is high and the resistance is high. Is that because the reversible vasoconstriction, or is that because the irreversible pulmonary vascular changes? How do you know?
You subject them to.
Obviously, without closing the VSD.
You subject them to a vasodilator.
You give them
Oxygen.
strong pulmonary vasodilator. So one of the strongest pulmonary vasodilators that we know of is nitric oxide. And in few places they are not available. So you can give 100% oxygen. So you ventilate them with 100% oxygen. This will cause pulmonary vasodilatation. And then if the pulmonary vascular resistance has increased because of reversible vasoconstriction, you reverse that and you actually get higher blood flow to the pulmonaries, and then you calculate lower pulmonary vascular resistance. So then you call that a reversible increase in the pulmonary vascular resistance, and then you probably will be able to close it. Okay. So we measure pulmonary vascular resistance as Wood units. So, and since Wood units depend on the size of the patient, you index that to body surface area. So you get Wood unit per meter square body surface area. So that's indexed pulmonary vascular resistance. So indexed pulmonary vascular resistance above 8 Wood unit per meter square is prohibitive. Less than 4 is quite favorable for closure of the defect. In between is borderline. So obviously you want it to be low and then reversible, rather than high and irreversible. Okay. You should not give a patient a decision that you are Eisenmenger syndrome and you just get out of any surgical or intervention list without documenting that by cath. Okay? Because you frequently get surprised. We have seen patients in the 20s with unrestricted VSDs who were not Eisenmenger.
35.
Sorry?
35.
Even 35. So these are really outliers. This is very exceptional, very unusual, but you get these patients from time to time. So just not don't give a patient that you're just an Eisenmenger because he is 7 years old without actually documenting that.
So the ones who have had 25 good units, when you start.
No, 35 years of age.
35 years old.
Yes, we've seen such patients.
Wow.
Okay, so this is an X-ray showing the high pulmonary blood flow because of a big VSD, unrestricted with high pulmonary flow. So you get the cardiomegaly, you get the pulmonary artery shadow, you get the lung plethora. This is a patient who's Eisenmenger. You get much less plethora. The cardiac shadow is much smaller, but the pulmonary artery shadow is still large. So we talked about Eisenmenger syndrome. It's an irreversible pulmonary vascular disease. Occurs usually in unrestricted VSD after like 2-3 years of age. The closure of the shunt is contraindicated because the natural history of these patients is much better than after closure. The median survival in these patients is approaching 20 years. While in ASD, this might develop a lot later, like 40-60 years of age. We've talked about diagnosis, and essentially, again, Soha will talk a lot about management. At least you do not close the shunt. Okay. So how do you measure QPQS? So again, what is QPQS? The ratio between the amount of pulmonary blood flow to the systemic pulmonary blood flow. How do you measure that?
You get pressure.
Okay, there are different ways of measuring that. You can do that by echo. Very inaccurate. We do not depend on that, but there are calculations by echo. The gold standard, the gold standard is measuring that by cath, which is called the fixed principle. We'll talk about that. So actually here we're not measuring QPQS, we're calculating QPQS. Okay. But the third way, which is actually quite good, is the cardiac MRI. Actually, by cardiac MRI, you actually measure amount of blood flow rather than, but obviously you cannot measure pressures or resistance. So you can measure QPQS by MRI. So we'll quickly go through the fixed principle. So now you need a marker to see to get diluted in the blood, and then you see the concentration in that marker, and then you estimate if there is more blood going to the pulmonary or to the systemic, depending on that marker. And the easy marker here is to use oxygen. So you don't have to get a dye or a radionuclide or something. You can just measure oxygen in the systemic veins and systemic arteries, pulmonary veins and pulmonary arteries, and then you can calculate by the difference in oxygen saturations. So I won't bother you with the complex equations, but you just get to know that here this is the blood flow, and from these equations you actually get pulmonary blood flow and systemic blood flow. We're not interested to know the actual cardiac output. We do not want to know what is the absolute figure of the systemic flow. We just want to know the ratio in between. So lots of things will actually be cancelled if you divide them together. Okay, and then you end up with a ratio between the difference in saturations between systemic arteries, systemic veins, to the difference between pulmonary veins, pulmonary artery. So the pressure, the saturation difference across the systemic circulation with the saturation difference across the pulmonary circulation. So you measure the oxygen saturation in the aorta. And then, so this is the oxygen saturation that's going to the systemic circulation. and then the blood coming back goes to the systemic veins, SVC and IVC. So the mixed venous saturation. By mixed venous saturation, you get saturation in SVC and IVC, and then you multiply 3 times the SVC times 1 over the IVC, and you get that divided by 4. So that's the mixed venous saturation. So you get the difference between the saturation in the aorta and the mixed venous saturation, and then you divide that by the oxygen difference across the lung. So the blood coming back from the lung, pulmonary veins, and the blood going to the lungs, pulmonary arteries. So that's the saturation in the pulmonary veins will be higher than the pulmonary arteries. And this difference should be the same as the blood going to the systemic, because the oxygen supplied by the lung should be equal to the oxygen extracted by the tissues. Okay? So let's assume a patient has oxygen mixed venous saturation of 60, and then the saturation in the pulmonary arteries is 80, while the saturation in the left atrium is 100, saturation in the aorta is 100. So do you think there is a shunt or there is no shunt here? There is a shunt. Why is that? There is step up of oxygen. So the blood coming back from the body had the saturation of 60, and then the saturation increased to become 80. So probably some amount of oxygenated blood has went with the deoxygenated blood, so that it increased the saturation. So now the saturation has increased, and this step up is significant. So there is significant left to right shunt. What would be the QPQS in such patients? So again, we measure pressure difference across systemic circulation. So saturation aorta minus saturation in mixed venous. So now this is 40. So 40 divided by 100 minus 80 equal 20. So 40 divided by 20 equal 2. So the QPQS in this patient is 2 to 1. So the amount of pulmonary blood flow is higher than the amount of systemic blood flow 2 times. Do you get that? So, and do not mix these up. So this is ratio between pulmonary and systemic, while you measure first systemic difference divided by pulmonary difference. Okay? So 100 minus 60 divided by 100 minus 80, 40 over 20, that's equal to. So QPQS is 2 to 1. So let's assume that you have measured the pressure and the saturation in the right ventricle, and the saturation was also 80. So is that an ASD, a VSD, or a PDA? Sorry?
If it was 8, it's 16 RA, 16 SVC.
So 60 in right atrium,
Yes.
80 in right ventricle, 80 in pulmonary artery.
Yes.
So it's a VSD because now the oxygenated blood has went into the right ventricle, while it was still in the so the right ventricle had higher saturation, so got the oxygenated blood, while the blood in the right atrium had less oxygenation. Do you get that?
Yes.
What if the mixed venous saturation from SVC, IVC were 60, while the saturation in the right atrium was 80, and then kept 80, 80?
Yes.
That's an ASD. Okay? If again that were both 60 and then you measured in the pulmonary artery, this could have been a PDA. So now from saturations, you roughly get that you know there is a shunt or not, you know the level of the shunt, and you know the magnitude of the shunt, just by getting the oxygen, which is a naturally occurring marker in the blood. Okay? So we've talked today about pathophysiology of left-right shunts. How do you think about blood flowing from the left to the right? We talked about people having 2 circulations, pulmonary and systemic. They flow in series. They flow in a long queue. In a normal person, pulmonary flow has to be equal to the systemic blood flow because the circulation quality is serious. The blood flow is equal to the pressure gradient divided by the pulmonary vascular resistance, the vascular resistance in that bed. So pressure divided by the resistance. The term QP/QS is the ratio between pulmonary blood flow and systemic blood flow, and it should normally be 1. We talked about blood passing from the high pressure to low pressure chambers. We talked about blood flowing from the aorta to pulmonary because higher systemic vascular resistance. So the ventricle has to generate higher pressure. So the pressure in the aorta is higher than the pulmonary. So blood passes from the aorta to the pulmonary. If a patient has a VSD, blood will go from the left ventricle to the right ventricle, again because of the left ventricle generating higher pressure because of the high systemic vascular resistance. Blood will go from the left atrium to the right atrium in case of ASD because of the worse compliance of the left ventricle, so higher LV end diastolic pressure, so higher left atrial pressure. And then we talked about chamber enlargement. So we said an ASD will get dilated right side, while the VSD gets dilated left side, and both get dilated pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. We talked about the pathophysiology of Eisenmenger syndrome. We talked about definitions of unrestricted VSD. So what's the difference between restrictive and unrestricted VSD? We talked about shunt calculations. Do you have any questions?
You can answer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.